Hi, welcome to the Always Evolving podcast. I'm your host, Dr. Elizabeth Fedrick. Boundaries is such a buzzword these days, but what actually is a boundary and why are they so hard to implement in our relationships? Here with us today is Katherine Mcnichol, registered psychotherapist. Katherine is providing us with some great tips and very helpful steps for setting effective boundaries. It's okay that we don't have it all figured out. We're all just taking it a day at a time. This is Always Evolving with Dr. Liz. Hi, Katherine. Welcome to Always Evolving.
Hi.
So happy to have you here.
Happy to be here.
Yes, absolutely. So today we are going to talk about boundaries, such a buzzword all over the place. We hear about this a lot, and as much as it's talked about, so many people still struggle with setting them and really with holding them is probably the biggest struggle. Mm-hmm. Tell us before we jump in who you are, what you do, what type of work you specialize in, and then we'll get going.
Sure. I am a registered psychotherapist here in Ontario, Canada. I also do a little bit of coaching on the side in terms of like groups and doing presentations. And I focus a lot of my social media content on this very topic, boundaries, how to set them, and the common struggles and barriers people face when setting them and enforcing them.
Yeah, it's so important. How do you define boundaries in the most simplest of definitions?
I like to define boundaries as these like limitations and things that you set around protecting yourself. So they're not really about controlling other people. But they're really about things that you can do to protect yourself and your own well-being.
Right. Mm-hmm. From your experience with the clients that you work with, and maybe even from your own personal experience, what is the biggest struggle with setting boundaries? Like, why is that so hard for so many of us?
There's a lot of different barriers that kind of get into the way of people setting boundaries, but I would say the most common one is guilt.
And
yeah, just the guilt that we often face, which is actually really common to feel after setting boundaries, is just the self-doubt and guilt we feel almost right after we're doing it.
And I think the distinction really is that between guilt and shame, like in those type of situations, is that, guilt being that I've done something wrong and shame being that I am wrong, right? And the beliefs that were instilled in a lot of us who struggle with boundaries in childhood, that we don't have the right to our own opinions or decisions or feelings even. What does that work look like to identify if those beliefs are going on for you? And I mean, I get we have 10 minutes, so I know this is a complex question, but just from a high level perspective, how do we dig into that to figure out if it's a belief?
Well, it's kind of identifying what are the things that we're believing to be true. And a lot of the things that we believe and we've been conditioned to believe aren't really true, or just they don't serve us anymore. Like they're things that we used to believe and we thought served us at one point, and over time throughout our own development and our own growth, we just learned that certain things that we were holding on to and believing just aren't helping us anymore, helping us feel good about ourselves, getting us to the point we want. And a lot of us have experience with just cultural or even social conditioning around expectations. It's not okay to set boundaries with certain people. It's not okay to set boundaries in certain expectations. So it just makes us question, like, is it okay for me to prioritize myself? Why? And that's why a lot of people feel bad about doing it when they're faced with conflict, when you're simply trying to take care of yourself, when you're trying to set boundaries. It it feels so confusing to the psyche, because for most of us, we've been conditioned to not say no.
Yeah.
To make it easier for other people, be available for everybody else's needs. So to not do that, to kind of prioritize yourself, protect yourself, feels so confusing.
And we hear our clients so often say, I feel so selfish. And that is often the expression of that I feel bad. I feel like I'm not being caring or considerate in the way that I have been so deeply programmed to be. And you're right, it does create a lot of confusion. When you're helping someone learn to initially start boundaries, to set boundaries, where do you start? Like, what even verbiage do you suggest? What does that look like?
Well, I say the first step is always you need to determine what the boundary is before you even think about communicating it.
Sure.
Like sometimes we get stuck, like something happens, we're trying to set a boundary, but we're really not really sure what the boundary is yet.
Yeah.
So I would say the first step is you need to figure out what that boundary is and what you want it to be first before you even try to communicate it. Because once you have clarity on what you're trying to accomplish, like say you're in a conversation with someone and you're trying to get a point across, like what's the purpose? If you don't know what the boundary is, you're not going to be able to communicate that purpose from a place of clarity and calmness for the other person to actually really take in and listen to what you're saying. So I would say the first step is you determining what the boundary is and what that looks like, what it sounds like, and how you want to communicate that boundary to the person or group that you're communicating it with.
Yeah, and I think we get asked a lot, at least I do, of like, how do I know if a boundary is needed? Like, if I'm first deciding, okay, what is the boundary, but how do I even know if it's needed? And I talk with a lot of my clients about even the awareness in our body. So if you're in conversation, you're in a situation, and your body is having some type of physiological reaction to that.
Yeah.
So tension or pain in your stomach, that's
Yeah.
often a good indicator that like, this might be a good place for a boundary.
Yeah, totally. And there's so many different types, right? There's like the physical ones there where boundaries concerning like your body and your physical space, like you need sleep, you're eating. And then there's like emotional boundaries, material boundaries we can set around like our time and energy, which is just protecting how we use our time and on activities. And then we all of us have like very specific non-negotiables, which aren't necessarily carried over for every single person. Like one person might be like, it's not okay for my kids to be in your backyard if there's no fence around the pool. Like that's a very specific non-negotiable that doesn't necessarily apply to everyone.
Yeah, great point. And they would know that because their body probably got really activated when they realized their child was outside without the fence around it. And they were like, oh my gosh, creates a lot of fear, which can be, manifest as irritability or anger outbursts, but it's really rooted in anxiety. And when we have anxiety about a situation, we often know like, okay, we need to check into what limits do we need to set. So if we, identify, okay, this is my boundary, is the next step then to communicate it? Like, is that what you usually suggest? Or is there an in-between there?
I would say there is an in-between, and that once you know what it is, what the boundary you want to set, you kind of want to decide beforehand that you're going to accept whatever outcome comes from setting that boundary.
Okay. What do you mean by that?
Because sometimes we have these imaginary conversations in our head around, I'm going to say this and they're going to say that, or I'm going to say this and they're going to do this. And rarely do things in real life happen the way they do in our head.
Right.
And we can't guarantee what the reaction is going to be like once we set that boundary. Like we might have some experiences where people are very respectful and they're open to what we're saying and asking for. And there's going to be some people who give you pushback. Yeah. And we want to be prepared for both of those outcomes, because if you only go in prepared for one, you're not going to be able to enforce that boundary because you're going to be filled with guilt and self-doubt. It's like, oh no, like they're upset with me. Did I do something wrong? Which is going to hinder your ability to really follow through and enforce the boundary you're wanting to set in the first place. So I would say determine what the boundary is, accept the multiple outcomes that could come from that.
Yeah.
Then you start to like, okay, what does that boundary look like? So, okay, I feel uncomfortable when you do this. And if it continues, what are you prepared to do if it continues?
Yeah. Yeah. Which is, and I love what you're saying about being prepared to accept the outcome. I role play that with my clients all of the time. Like, okay, we're going to role play a couple different scenarios of how they might respond, because you're right. When we feel brave, we go into it. We're like, all right, I got this. And then they say something that completely catches us off guard. It's really easy to start backtracking. But then what you're saying is, after we set it, now we do have to hold it. Otherwise, it's just a suggestion and it's not an actual boundary. What would be an example of maybe a boundary and a consequence that would be appropriate to go along with it? Not to put you on the spot. Sorry. There's like 100 options here.
Well, it could be what's appropriate for that interaction. So it could be you're having a conversation with someone and things are getting escalated. Right? Maybe we're getting a little heated because we're talking about something personal or something that's upsetting. It could be, I see that you're getting upset, but if you continue to yell at me, I'm going to end this conversation or I'm going to leave the room.
Yeah.
So you're saying the boundary of you have access to me when you treat me in the way that I'm okay with, that I am available for. I'm not necessarily discontinuing or dismissing how you're feeling. I'm acknowledging how you're feeling, but there's a certain way that you need to treat me in order to continue to have access to me.
Yes. Yeah. And that is so powerful, even to validate their experience. Like,
Mm-hmm.
I can see you're feeling really overwhelmed right now, and I have
Mm-hmm.
empathy for that.
Yeah.
And I am not going to be part of this escalation. And
Yeah.
again, so hard to do. It takes
Mm-hmm.
like start with baby steps, allow it to really be a snowball,
Yeah.
practice it, role play it, do it in the mirror, whatever you've got to do.
Mm-hmm.
Katherine, where can people find you and more of your insights? Your website,
Mm-hmm.
social media, where can you be found?
My Instagram is my name, so it's Katherine.Mcnichol. So at Katherine.Mcnichol, I talk a lot about boundaries and guilt. I also have a boundaries toolkit that you can find in my bio that goes over a really specific six-step formula on how to set boundaries. If you want to work with me individually, you can find me at www.kirowellness.com.
Very good. And we'll make sure all of that is in the show notes. Thank you so much, Katherine, for your time. I really appreciate it.
Absolutely. Have a great day.
You too. And thank you all for joining us on the Always Evolving podcast. If you like what you heard, make sure to rate and review this episode, subscribe to my YouTube channel, and find me on Instagram at Dr. Elizabeth Fedrick. This is Always Evolving with Dr. Liz.